much. Those are important words that we must take to heart. Now, the Dean's Honorary Lecture, that was actually introduced in the architecture class the year before the Günther Bock Prize. So in 2006, the first Dean's Honorary Lecture ended the academic year. It's seen in so many ways as part of the lecture series, but it's also its own little series that runs annually. And I am on the architecture class behalf and Städelschule's behalf, obviously absolutely delighted that there are two people amongst us, and they, so to speak, belong to Städelschule. That's Mark and Beatrice. And Mark gave the first lecture in 2006, and Beatrice gave a lecture in 2013. And insofar as the ambition of this lecture is to honor people who've made a significant contribution to the academic realm of architecture, to architecture in its institutional form, so to speak, or to the practice, then certainly Mark and Beatrice represent such significant figures on the international scene. I have to also admit that there's a certain assumed vanity in this series, of course. We would like to see us taking part in a certain world where there are people who quite simply are more important than others. In some respects. And for that reason, the series also makes sure that we are able to host these people here, and that helps to infuse basically our discussions and our work over the years with certain standards. So tonight it's my ambition, and I'll do like, I think I can do like this. Hold a second. We'll find your presentation afterwards. Yeah. So it is tonight then my great pleasure and also honor to welcome Farshid Moussavi, a person who straddles these two worlds of academia and practice in a very impressive sense. Her practice based in London. Farshid Moussavi Architecture has in its portfolio a series of significant admirable buildings. She's also a professor of practice, in practice of architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design. And this is also where she ended her architectural education. One that began at Dundee University in England and then went on to Bartlett School of Architecture before then she ended at GSD. After she worked both for, obviously not at the same time, but she worked for Renzo Piano Building Workshop in Genoa and then for OMA in Rotterdam. And I am guessing, but perhaps fairly certain, those must have been also seminal experiences in forming an approach to architecture and an approach to your practice. Her academic life sees her then at Harvard. She's been a visiting professor at UCLA, Columbia University, Princeton. For all of 8 years, she was teaching at the Architectural Association in London, and she's been the head of Institute of Architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. That was from 2002 till 2005. The list would of course go on and on, but let me briefly mention she has served as a board member for a number of important institutions that includes the British Council, as well as serving the City of London. She's a member of the board, currently a member of a board of trustees of both Whitechapel Gallery and the Architectural Foundation in London. And for her work over the years, she's earned both the RIBA Gold and Presidential Medals and the Sterling Prize for Architecture, to mention just 3. Among a long list of recent and ongoing projects, I merely mention 2 residential projects in France and the completed Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland in the US. And I shall not dwell on what you surely will share with us in a moment. But let me recall another moment for you all. It was in Covent Garden, I believe in 1994. It was in the graduate design studio that Jeffrey Kipnis led at the AA, and where I had been studying and was assisting at the time. And Farshid and her partner at that time came in to show Jeff, with the whole studio present, their winning project for the Yokohama Ferryport Terminal. And it basically went from there to being a buzz in the school for a long, long time. Also in part because, in fact, one of the crucial models, I think, in the follow-up to it all was the production of a surely difficult physical model that was produced in the workshop at the AA. And I remember, if you allow, we're more or less the same generation. I remember then being both not only impressed like everyone else, but also really, well, it left a lasting impression, quite simply. To see someone like you, so strong, yet so young, and with that kind of success early on, and being, obviously, as time has shown, being able to take that challenge on and complete that project, which of course was the first of a series in that partnership and later on now in your own practice. And I think it goes to testify the incredible energy and force that you put in, obviously, both your academic career and your professional career. The former, the academic career, has led over the last 10 years to 3 books being published based on research done at the GSD in your studios. These are The Function of Ornament in 2006, It's the Function of Form in 2009, and it's The Function of Style in 2014. In that book, published in 2009, The Function of Form, you say, we no longer need to think in terms of irreconcilable oppositions, and you mention amongst others, mind versus matter, production versus perception, rational versus sensorial, old versus new, difference versus repetition. And the book witnesses, like the others, that you, through an erudite exploration, in this case of architectural formal typologies and geometric systems, that you have made an important contribution to an ongoing and sadly remaining challenge, at least sadly in my view, to revise or altogether reconceptualize stagnant oppositional dialectics that have plagued architecture for too long. And at the same time, these books, together with the projects that you have produced, present an insistence on architecture's contribution to our culture on its own disciplinary terms. That is, the insistence on the value of our discipline towards the built environment and for our lives in the cities. And this is no less, since there are other and not equal takes on the same. To me, it represents an extremely affirmative approach. These are affirmative ideas that constitute, quite simply, a form of celebration. So we are greatly honored, Farshid, that you are here tonight. Please welcome Farshid Moussavi.
Well, Johan, thank you very much for this generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here. First time at the Städelschule, first time in Frankfurt. What do I do here? Wait. Yes. It's always very strange. Well, first of all, I should say I'm also honored to follow the footsteps of the previous speakers, Mark and Beatrice, who've given this very important lecture. It's very strange always sitting there hearing you know, your biography read out, because it always feels sitting there much more glorious than how it feels day to day. Just as a note also, I think to the students, when I was at school, there was this idea that there is a kind of a student and there is the kind of the teacher, and so there is a learner and there is an instructor, and my experience is that has shifted completely, that actually those of us who are also out there practicing, whether it's practicing education or practicing architecture, we are learning. We are having to unlearn all the time, and we are having to learn new things, because reality around us is changing all the time. So you can think of this lecture as what I've been learning in the last 6 years since I have set up, you know, my new practice, FMA, because I suddenly found myself actually in a kind of a new situation, not only personally, but the world that I had to practice within. So I'm going to focus on activism. Today we are constantly inundated or surrounded by politics with a capital P, big issues, big manifestos, big narratives, large-scale changes, and we've become even more aware that as citizens we have a role to play by exerting, let's say, our agency as activists. But of course we are citizens, and as citizens we can exert our agency in many ways, and politics affects us in all kinds of ways. As citizens, you know, our visa status could imply we can study or work in certain places or not. The changes of borders may imply us being able to use certain materials to design buildings with or not, as we can employ our professional, let's say, hat and decide to work for certain clients or not, to work in certain areas of the world or not. We can even raise money perhaps as citizens to build perhaps our own projects. But I want to talk about the politics of buildings. So not our politics as citizens, but the politics of buildings, and how we should approach buildings, knowing what the politics of buildings is like, how buildings in the absence of their architect actually play certain politics. In most of the well-known historical manifestos of architecture, we find ideals of how architecture should be connected to and even change the world, and theories about how buildings should be used to facilitate those ideals. Think of Semper's great grand manifesto that all buildings should be made with motifs originating in certain fabrication techniques to generate symbolic meaning, or Regel's advocacy that buildings should express a race, a place, or time. Gideon's notion that buildings should represent the spirit of an age. The modernists who proposed, you know, using mass production, industrialization as a manifestation of the modern age. A number of them, from Viollet-le-Duc to functionalism, proposed metaphors like the machine or the organism, that to bring all various parts of a building, to unify them, in the service of their ideals. Now, the intention of these manifestos was to unite buildings around such ideals, which, however admirable, focus mostly on what buildings should represent, rather than the actual role they played in everyday life. Today, I think we need to question whether representing external narratives is the way to instigate buildings' political potential, and if not, what approach we should take. So the process of design is inundated by diverse requirements that relate to the politics of the everyday, the rights to personal security, the rights of light, the need to address climate change, complying with planning regulations that negotiate rights to the development of cities, and so on. And all of these have led to different coefficients for buildings, such as rights of light, security, fire engineering, sustainability, facade engineering, health and safety. It just goes on. And for each one of these, there is a consultant who works alongside the architect and enters the design process at different stages, and introduces much unpredictability to the design process. Enhanced levels of security may imply an imminent change to the entry sequence of a building you're designing. A change of the city's mayor every 4 years may imply a change in program. It might mean shifting the site entirely to another location. It might mean the change of the budget of the project, and all of these mean that the architect has to somehow adjust, sometimes to a lesser, sometimes to a greater degree. Macro narratives or unifying themes, I think, neutralize the agency of buildings, and as well the architect to navigate him or herself within this dynamic situation and to engage with each one of these issues that I believe give multiple ways in which buildings can influence everyday life. Now, the task of the architect is to coordinate coefficients for buildings with the associated consultants and determine how they relate, how they are to come together, what kind of priorities they are to be set. And it is exactly in that process that I think that the politics of buildings are shaped. Not by bringing a building's elements in the service of the representation of a grand manifesto, but through the way they are arranged, which results and manifests itself through a series of affects. Just to clarify the use of affects here, in the sense of, in the kind of philosophical sense of Spinoza, elaborated by Deleuze and Guattari, as a series of, if you like, intensities that are emitted by bodies, by objects, by things, as a consequence of how they are assembled. And their relevance in the subjects of activism or politics of buildings is that they lead to the augmentation or the diminution of our bodies, of our body's capacity to act. So if we look at this, for example, a door or a gate in the perimeter wall of a building may generate effects of closure and traversability. Handrails designed in this particular way around museum exhibits may generate visibility but also untouchability. Skylights in a train station may generate effects of transparency as well as protection. So what is the agency of the architect in this process of assembling a building? Imagine that you are buying this apartment. You survey the room to imagine how you would occupy it, whether it suits you. The placement of the window in this room is an architectural decision, not the window, not the wall, not the floor, not necessarily the size of the space. Those are often given either by the budget for the amount of glass you can use, or the amount of the environmental regulation of how much transparency you can have, or market-related issues of how large this room should be for the apartment to be sold for a certain amount. But the decision to locate the building in this asymmetric position, I would say, is an architectural decision and down to the agency of the architect. If you place this window centrally in this room, you will have illumination, you would have spent the right amount of money on the right amount of glass, you would have the right amount of U values for the room, but it would be impossible to have to locate the bed in a place that would have privacy. You would have illumination and you would have exposure to the outside. Whereas by locating the window to one side, you suddenly have one end of the room where you can gain privacy, and you can put a chair perhaps here if you want to look out and read a book. Approaching architecture as an assemblage, which in this case, as I mentioned, is the wall, the window, the floor, the interior walls, enables it to be connected to aesthetic decisions as well, and connecting the aesthetic decisions with such practicalities of everyday life, or we could say the micropolitics of everyday life, in the same way that generating transparency and exposure for a hotel is a kind of political decision that is connected to aesthetic decisions. The freedom to expose yourself is connected with perceiving transparency in the context of a hotel room, in an urban context, which this is. This way of approaching buildings locates the question of agency, not what a building represents, but in what way its aesthetic proposition affects people in everyday life. Here is the Smithsonian East Wing by I.M. Pei, where unlike on the inside of the building, where people are discouraged from touching its sharp corners, its artifacts, its sharp corners on the exterior are so inviting to touch that it has invited people to touch it, and they have worn the edges away. Similarly, at the Guggenheim Museum, the affect of lowness of the handrail. Now, maybe the handrail was designed at a different building regulation time when you could do it so low, but the point is that its lowness it still transmits, and it has the result that people would otherwise pass through its ramping galleries as if they are in a supermarket, would stop. They stop constantly and they look at the art. So the handrail, I would say, in the Guggenheim is an agent. And next time you're there, please look at it, because it happens all the time. So what does thinking of buildings as aesthetic propositions mean for users? What kind of agency do users have in this relationship? Now, the relationship between object and subject in everyday life has been discussed mostly in terms of the agency of human subjects. I'm thinking of phenomenology, for example, that is concerned with how people gain access to the kind of the beings of objects. But objects in themselves have no agency usually. But of course, the difference between those kinds of objects and architectural objects is that architectural objects do not exist. They are constructed by the architect or architects, and therefore it is important to discuss both their construction and also the kind of relationship they aim to set up vis-a-vis people. Now, here is a cineplex that we designed back at FOA times. It transmits a cluster of, it has a mirror reflective cladding that transmits affects of reflectivity, glare, deformation, and it has the consequence that at a number of points around the building, people systematically stop and salute the building. No matter what sex or age, something happens between the buildings and people, and of course, it was not this is kind of, if you like, accidental. It was not our intention to ask people to respect this kind of building, nor was it a kind of a request by the brief. We can look at this in a similar way to the Guggenheim window handrails that stop people falling into the atrium, but also have this extra, they perform in this extra way of allowing people to look at the art, as our intention to shift the presence of a cineplex, which is inward looking usually, and doesn't perform outwardly, to shift that kind of presence to something new. Now, the traditional representational approach to buildings assumes that there is a direct road between the fact of people looking at the building and understanding it, which, of course, we know no longer exists. I don't know whether you know the story behind this dress and the color of it that was on the internet and people disagreeing over it. I think it shows us that the encounter between the kind of experience that results by people encountering buildings is a kind of a co-production. It has as much to do with the specifics of buildings as the desires, the backgrounds, the biographies of people who come to encounter it. So here is a kind of a diagram that I've tried to map, if you like, the relationship between the architect and people. So if we think of on the left, those kind of dots, or imagine them as different components, elements of a building, and the architect is kind of pretty much in charge of, despite working with a lot of other consultants, the architect is the only person who actually has the mission to bring them together, and sets up priorities of how they relate to one another, etc. These end up producing a building with a certain scale, with a certain materiality, etc., that transmits a number of affects, a cluster of affects. And then on the right, you see people, and their disposition to buildings are unique. Not everyone enters the building. Some people enter only parts of it. Some people don't enter it at all and only walk around it. And as a result of person A, B, C, and their own biography, background, interest, and their limits of how they can encounter the building, they come to experience a number of different numbers of those affects and come away with their own unique experiences of the building. So we could see the politics of buildings as far as the architect is concerned in the assembly of those elements, but with remembering and the transmission or the generation of certain affects, but upon the understanding that the relationship between them and the end users is not one of determination. Architecture is more a proposition rather than a determination. But how do these ambitions stand up to the realities of practice? The word agency implies a certain freedom existing for the architect to arrange the elements differently. Then we should ask, can only architects who work with publicly funded projects pursue this kind of agency? How is it possible in the commercial realities of that an architect works within that kind of tend to encourage the repetition of the same? How can we as architects also pursue change, which is not necessarily market-driven? When a certain way of arranging, for example, seating in a cinema is deemed to be, let's say, optimum, it tends to generate a kind of a convention, as you see here. The seating arrangement in all of these cinemas is identical. And now the activity of watching movie in that kind of seating arrangement acquires a kind of naturalness, so people come to see movies in a way unthinkingly, unthinking about the experience of watching movies, even though the movies would be different. Whereas if the convention of the seating arrangement is changed, the traditional relationship between people and the activity of watching movies is changed. A kind of, even if it is just for a moment, a certain surprise or freedom is opened up for people who come to watch movies. So what would be the aim of this shifting of convention? Why is shifting conventions better than overthrowing them? Why change the relationship between people and buildings? Here is another older project, the Yokohama passenger port terminal that we did back at the FOA days. It shifted a number of conventions that influenced the way people would typically engage with the ferry terminal. Instead of the conventional linear route that takes people directly from the route of the pier to the cruise terminal, it proposed a circulation system that is made out of a series of loops to encourage people to meander, to bifurcate, to do different different things while they are there, and that was then translated through a series of branching, bifurcating floor plates that would connect people systematically to the levels above and below to where they were, to free them from the habit of passing through the terminal simply, unthinkingly, so that they might choose it as a place to sit down and paint. So by shifting the conventions around how a building for traveling is arranged, I would say we loosened the relationship between people and a ferry terminal to open up other ways in which they would encounter it. The philosopher Jacques Rancière, who's written a lot about the relationship between aesthetics and politics, argues that the significance of aesthetics lies in the fact that what can be apprehended by the senses determines the possibilities for participation of individuals in the everyday life. For him, politics is a disruption or dissensus in the conventionally perceived or prescribed spaces to make that which did not have ground to be seen, so that active encounters would replace passive participation. So we could say that by making the arrangement of everyday life activities unfamiliar, we open up the possibility for people's bodies to fit everyday activities in a different way. But the efficacy of the architect is not to determine how they would fit those activities. It's not about telling people how to reside in a building, how to view art in a museum, how to work in offices, and so on. It doesn't have definitive outcomes. It resides in creating this kind of shifts that are not market-driven. They are instigated by the architect in how buildings are perceived to generate the kind of differences in buildings that call for a response or active participation from those who come to use them. Just to kind of map in a way this situation of finding oneself in a process of design that is no longer purely driven by the architect. It is highly dynamic and possibilities for architecture, or I would say politics of architecture, emerge throughout the process, not only at the beginning, and the process needs to be highly, the architect needs to remain highly elastic. I have found that actually one needs to really think differently about buildings being about single narratives, certainly grand narratives, and that actually the potential of buildings is really at their own scale. We can get together in academia and talk about what we've learned across time, across a number of buildings, but that a building's potential is at its own scale and with its own means. So we have completed a residential project recently and are about to finish another one. I thought I would share those with you and how we've kind of assembled them, and if there is time I'll show you a third one. So this is the residential project. Both residential projects are affordable housing, so low budget, and one of them, this first one, is in Nanterre, just Nanterre-La Défense, the major business district of the city. It just passes all the office developments. It's the first residential building there to be built for 35 years as a new thing to be done from now on. I won't get into this slide greatly, but just to every country has its own ways of procuring housing, and the UK has been very unhappy about the shortage of housing and the shortage of housing of the kind that is needed, and it is the architect enters this process quite late on, and what allowed us to do what we did with this project in Nanterre was reliant of a method of procuring architectural projects that is design driven. So private investors need to come and bid for a site. obviously putting a financial proposition down, but also they come with 3 architects that they would be happy to work with. And if they are selected, then the architects need to be to compete against each other, and it's the city that chooses, not the client, because they kind of pre-selected the architects. That means that, of course, design is a part of the agenda here, or the architecture. The site being by the Grand Axe, so this is, we are just at the, just on the other side of the Arch, obviously brought certain questions, how, for example, the way living in the city in a collective residential building limits people's interaction with the outdoors, because you don't have your own garden. The site sits on that red bit, so it sits just where the extension to the Grand Axe has been made towards the River Seine. It kind of bends to go towards it. It is sandwiched between 2 cemeteries, so this exceptional location left it poised for a kind of a new relationship with the Axe, but also with the natural environment, because it has these 2 very green cemeteries either side. Now, in a multi-story residential building, it is the envelope that I would call is the agent, determining the relationship between people and the outdoors, between public and the private realm, and the way that the building is integrated in its context. The shape of the envelope, as dictated by the site outline, would have been this kind of deep slab form, which obviously, because of its depth, would limit people's relationship to the outside. Some rooms would not be near the exterior. And even if the envelope would be designed with balconies, as you can see in this slide, because you would have the kind of the partitions between neighbors, their relationship to the urban context outside, or even the natural environment, would be limited, because you literally have to kind of bend out to see outside from your balcony. The other convention that we decided to question was how living in the city has been forcing people to live, to decide between either communal life or segregation, and I'll explain why. As these diagrams show, in a multi-story residential building, the depth of the floor plate usually means, especially when it's slab form, we knew that we were working with that kind of shape site, means that you have a lot of neighbors sharing a corridor, which not only makes single aspect apartments, which are often dark and stuffy, but they're also socially unsustainable, because they can be kind of often frightening, dark. It also means that people pass each other's front door to go to their homes. Inherent in the corridor arrangement has been the assumption that neighbors will form a community. That needs to be questioned today, because the nature of neighbors today has changed from one of homogeneity to when most households comprised of a single, of a nuclear family, to difference, since today a household may mean singles, divorcees, same-sex families, co-living, multi-generation, the elderly. So the communal corridor, we could say, is a vestige of the modernist vision of communal apartments, which went as far as proposing communal kitchens, dining rooms, terraces, even telephones. A model of coexistence derived from an idea of community that is obviously redundant today. It falsely assumes that people who live in close proximity desire any kind of closeness, and practically inconvenient, because it belonged to a time when people would go to work and come back at the same time, rather than have unpredictable comings and goings, which disturbs each other, or that they came from similar cultures and backgrounds, which in a big city like Paris, that cannot be assumed. And it also assumes that people were using primarily their home as a place to live, which has also changed because people work at home, and it harks back to a time also when people knew their neighbors rather than living amongst a rotation of strangers, which is increasingly not the case thanks to Airbnb. Paris has as many hotel rooms as has Airbnbs. So the implication of all these diverse arrangements practically is that neighbors in multi-story buildings may have very different habits, and that they might intrude on each other's life next door. So designing for such buildings should begin from understanding the fact that the only reason why people are living next to each other in such multi-story buildings is because there is not enough space in the city for people to have their own house. So, an alternative to those this kind of collective building is a kind of recent initiatives that try to that have been designing bespoke buildings for each one of these household types. You know, a home for kind of young graduates, a kind of a co-living that gives them a kind like a hotel room and everything else is shared, or the multi-generation house. This is actually a kind of a German example that brings together a kindergarten and all, homes for the elderly as a way to somehow deal with the rising costs of childcare, etc. The question with this kind of model is segregating different types of household the right answer today? For a start, specialized housing means that people have to move when their circumstances change. They may not want to. It also means accepting social segregation, because obviously the young professionals are going to be housed in the periphery, and the wealthy families are going to live in the city center. It also means that we start accepting such notions as affordable housing, which ends up being translated architecturally through a low budget and therefore quite back to basics, if you like, stripped back aesthetics, as opposed to luxury housing that is more crafted and unique. So the question we set was, can we not find a solution where people would live together in the city but separately? We can think of Sloterdijk, soap bubbles, etc. Our brief, we had an amazing brief to begin with, which was the vision of Nanterre's mayor, who is a communist, that proposed that we would accommodate different household types in one building. So it was a great starting point. 91 social and price-capped apartments, 110 rooms for students, and just one level of maisonette penthouses at the top. So given this brief, which was not at all about segregation, but the opposite, we saw our agency as generating maximum privacy between these different kinds of residents, and as well how to bring them as close as possible to this, to the nature outside. This is a kind of just a kind of a suggesting diagram of, rather than thinking of it as a kind of a one single narrative, we thought of the building as a kind of an assemblage, whereby different elements of the building, either individually or through grouping with other elements, would perform in the following ways. The envelope is designed shallower, not its full depth. It's 12 meters shallow to avoid the typical corridor arrangement that enforces, sociability and collectivity on people. So instead of the 12 meter, we have, in the 12 meter, we can divide the apartments laterally with point access circulation. So every two neighbors share a stair and a lift. So it's extremely private because you only share your front door with one other neighbor. The core, the structure is located on the party walls between neighbors and on the facade, so all the darker parts. All the red interior walls are non-structural, which means that residents are empowered to reconfigure the units as their circumstances change without asking for any kind of permission from anyone. And this was particularly kind of more relevant in the kind of the French scene, because they have this great kind of setup where people who place their name down for an apartment can actually come and ask for their walls to be arranged for them as they will, as they choose to, which in this case meant, of course, giving them a lot more possibility of, potentially having the whole thing as an open space. So glazed at both ends, the units benefit from lots of natural ventilation and light. We can then also provide each unit with outdoor spaces at both ends, so that the interiors could spill outdoors. With this arrangement, the apartments, I would say, are very similar to a single-family terraced house. They have privacy, they have private external space, and a strong contact with the outdoor, which we will see. Now, to shift the strict separation between the building and the exterior big open space, provided by the acts, by the kind of Paris acts, we employed or activated the agency of the floor plates. We shifted them on plan by 2 degrees along the length of the building. This gives a certain axiality rather than verticality to the building, but it also has a kind of it develops a kind of an environmental agency too, because the building acquires a step silhouette, and every floor shades the other floor as a consequence of this this shift on the kind of plan, which means that only the red floors would need shutters for privacy and shade, and the other ones can be left open. It also means that every apartment has the outdoor spaces of each apartment is varied to a loggia on one side and a balcony on the other, and the floor above would have its loggia on the opposite side and its balcony on the other side. And we will see that this creates a lot of variation for the residents. Now, to reinforce the inclusive approach of the building, we have left the interiors very bare. So usually in the UK, you would fit out the kitchen for them and fit out the bathroom, and a lot of the building budget goes to those, and it's perhaps not really what people want, and then people are stuck with it. They may not have the resources to just throw them away and start with their own. So here they're intentionally made very bare to actually prompt people to appropriate them as they want, and also to make the interior really the area where people express their affordability, if you like. Instead, on the exterior, we have taken all the elements that are common to the different kinds of residents across the building, and those are colored here, and we have designed them exactly in the same way, which is a little bit like a houseman approach, if you like, who, of course, the typical houseman block was very much about embracing the kind of social strata of the city in one block. It did have, of course, a hierarchy. The people who were less wealthy and had to walk up the stairs were at the top, and there was no outdoor space. But it kind of embraced that idea that the city ultimately belongs to everybody, and every building should accommodate everyone. So in our case, the step silhouette, gives them all this kind of differentiated spaces either side. They are marked with the kind of the green and the blue. So the blue is the loggia, and the green is the balcony, and the kind of the greeny color is the loggia that you can close. And these, which are kind of intermediate spaces, neither inside nor outside, without any function, so that again they would prompt people to just use them as they will. They vary along, so these are two sides of the same apartment. They vary along the size of the building. So this is kind of one end of the apartment, that's kind of somewhere in the middle, and then it changes again here. So they change depths, which means that as a result, we get this kind of variation, choice given to people, which are architectural choices. The units may be the same size, but they will have different size balconies, which are not part of the kind of the price of the apartment. They will have slightly different geometries depending on whether you're at the end of the taper or in the middle, and they have also sectional variation, which we will see. what is interesting to see is that the top 2 floors, which are the penthouses, are actually not very different in size to the social apartments. They have a greater terrace. So it's really their contact with the outdoors that gets greater as a kind of a point of luxury rather than the size of the apartment. The other things that I think carry agency and kind of give architecture relevance in terms of people living here are, of course, what materials you use. We decided to take all these basic elements. These are, extremely simple elements that a residential building is made out of: shutters, the handrails, dividing walls, soffits, and glazed walls, and use materials that require very little maintenance, because if you live in a collective building, having to pay for maintenance every large sums of money is disempowering. It's aluminium, it's glass, it's hardwood, very little paint. And these together are, as we've been seeing, not assembled as a kind of a thin membrane, but as a zone. That they can appropriate in different ways. Now, each one of these elements that we could call micro agents carry also different other kinds of potential. For example, the shutters of the lodges would perhaps normally be designed with kind of these thin blade-like profiles. We have designed them with these diamond-shaped profiles, and that's because this shape allows us to widen the amount of view that you have in one direction, whilst still keeping the breadth or the width of the profiles, so that we could limit the views in from the other direction. These then are, as a result, as you see here, some of them are, depending on where you're looking at it, they can kind of obstruct your view completely, whereas here we were seeing some views through. And they change orientation. The shutters themselves are sliding, but each one of them, depending on where they are along the length of the building, they are rotated, in a fixed way rotated, as a way to, in order to respond to the different depths that we have behind, of space we have behind, but also the kind of the orientation of the sun relative to the building. As a result, the same anodized aluminium shutters catch the sun differently, and they kind of appear as kind of light gray to kind of darker ones, and these change throughout the day. And bring a certain amount of temporality to the building. Blue-black, for example, at night. So for the passers-by who would never even live in the building, their experience of the building becomes a building that actually changes throughout the day. And the shutters are, as I mentioned, are to slide, and people can either enclose the lodges entirely or open them partially to frame a view or to have sunlight coming in. And the other, as we see here, the other element, micro agent of these lodges is the dividing wall that we looked at, that you often get between neighbors, to invert the experience of it being a kind of a barrier. We have designed it with mirror-backed glass that introduces a sense of expansiveness to the lodges, as if there are no dividing walls. It displaces the distance and landscape that is behind forward, as if it's part of the foreground, as if it's part of the balcony. You don't need to lean out of your loggia to kind of feel part of the exterior. It is projected right in front of you, and it changes as you move. So the view or experience that you have is very much unique to each individual balcony, as the heights and orientation of the balconies change, of lodges change, but also as you move your head. Another element of the loggia, again, that is kind of instructive here in terms of what kind of experience it generates is the wall that divides the interior from the loggia, or we should say the glass wall, for budgetary reasons, and also I would say budgetary reasons. If we had more budget, we could have triple glass everywhere, but the only way to obtain the required environmental U values, energy values, was to introduce 50% solid, which are the kind of the dark bits, which would superimpose once again a kind of a verticality to the axiality of the floors that we had introduced. And now, to suppress this verticality, the solid bits are again clad with glass mirror filmed, with mirror-backed film, and that has the consequence that the solids disappear, of course, but also the exterior gets projected onto the building, which of course changes throughout the day as the light changes, but also as the shutters will cut this reflection in unintended ways by how the shutters are used by residents. Alongside each loggia, therefore, the experience of solidity, so this would be solidity, is exchanged for kind of liquidity, lightness, we could say, delicacy, interior, exterior continuity. As for the balconies, they don't have shutters, and so one of the main directions to distinguish them from the loggia was how to maximize the sense of openness rather than the privacy of the loggias. And so here the handrail is designed with just glass, no uprights, except that there is a kind of a slight frit onto it, which we will see in a minute. The section varies along the side of the building, so depending on which unit you would choose, you might have a triple height balcony or single height. The soffit of them is designed, painted, let's say, to be very dark, to frame the exterior landscape, to make it feel more open, but also to reduce the presence of lots of expansion joints that you need in concrete. So the soffit has a lot of those that disappear. So it's about making, I guess the point I'm trying to emphasize is making aesthetic decisions with the practical decisions that you need to make as an architect, because you have those choices, and because there is an aesthetic to any practical decision you make anyway. So here is the single height balcony. This is one of those triple height balconies. Here is one of the students' balconies. You see it's not any different to one of the apartments. They're very generous. The difference here is that every other partition, dividing wall, is lower because the university wanted to encourage a kind of social interaction between the students. In the loggias, these dividing walls, turn each balcony into a very unique space, just like the loggias. And I'm not sure if you can kind of see here, we are looking at one of the dividing walls, and on it we are seeing the landscape that is, again, behind you. It creates the illusion, if you like, that there is a continuity with nature, which of course there is never in the city. What is behind is projected forward. It is actually a kind of a landscape here that doesn't exist anywhere but in this balcony. So they become one. The handrail, as I mentioned, is all glass. And it is the frit on it is graduated to give low-level privacy, where people may, put things on their balcony, where furniture might be located, but it fades away to where plants might be placed so that light can reach people's plants, and we have been seeing a lot of plants on the balconies since the building kind of opened. So residents' belongings have been coming in. This is like on the first day in France. I'm not sure how you move in here, but in England you take everything through the elevator, and there they take them on these ladders, which is kind of a spectacle, resting on the facade. And during the first week, we could already see that the residents are of a very different kind, and that the process of the move meant quite different things to them. Could this be a single man occupying the corner apartment? he faces a sports arena. Obviously, he didn't mind that. Here's a single family focusing on the move. Here's a young professional who is clearly using the apartment already as a work-live space. Here is a student, a more traditional family where the grandmother is living, with the family, for them, furnishing the balcony and setting it up so that they could eat together was more important. While this resident with a narrow loggia chose to enjoy the view without having to bend out to see into the Axe. An astonishing number of residents, despite it being just really the first week, had set up their gardens already. And it has been interesting to also observe something else, that the residents chose to set up a Facebook page for themselves as a way to, if you like, I don't know if the right word is trade, to do things for each other, to communicate, if someone wants to get a tutor for their, student, teenager, and somebody else in the building might be able to offer that allows it to happen. Or if you want to fix your fridge and it's broken, you might do that for a neighbor in return for money, or I guess for other services. But it was very interesting to see that, people who may not be friends, but that actually the building and today with the kind of the digital platforms that we have, there is a benefit to living in proximity to very different people to yourself. And as long as that does not mean that we all have to be, one big happy family, and that privacy can be given to them. Some of them have been posting views of their apartments to me as they were kind of moving in, which has been really great. This is Jean-Pierre, fitting out his apartment to his own liking. We see natural light flooding into his apartment, unlike the single aspect apartments of units that I was showing you before. Emmanuel sent me this. He was super excited of the experience of nature he was having from his balcony. I think the building is one that allows very different people to live side by side each other without disturbing each other. It is in that sense very private, but it is also extremely urban. Here is a view of one apartment. You're looking at from the balcony of this apartment all the way through to the kind of the loggia at the other end. Wherever you are, there is a sense of interior-exterior continuity, but not to your neighbors. If a building is a proposition rather than a determination, then of course the only way to judge it is how retrospectively, when people are actually using it. I've been collaborating with a photographer, with an artist photographer, Stefan Gill, to document the relationship between the buildings that we've been working on in the last few years. Already in the first week, life, I would say, was pouring out into the loggias and the balconies, animating the building in all kinds of ways. But of course, it's not only the engagement of the building, the residents with the building, but also the building changing as the light and the kind of the environment around it changes. Here it is mid-morning, here it is late afternoon. It becomes quite dark, even brittle looking early evening. When the sky is blue, the building kind of is somehow drenched in the color blue that unifies all these different elements that would perhaps be more individually present to the eye. It has a sense of liquidity, I would say. When the sky is gray, it is a lot more gray. When the building's appearance, of course, also changes depending on where you're looking at it. On the north elevation facing one of the cemeteries, we don't have that shift of the floor plate, so the building is a lot more flat. And as you get close to it, you could perhaps see a slight relief into this flatness, as of course the loggias and the balconies do alternate still on this side. Along the south facade, am I seeing this right? I see it. Facing the axe, of course, we have this axiality. The floors seem to kind of somehow point down or away from the axe, even if it is slightly helping perhaps or prompting people to venture off the beaten track and to explore the areas surrounding to the cemeteries either side, which are incredibly well manicured and kept. Plenty of vegetation, which seems in quite sharp contrast to the building. However, the semi-transparent or the semi-open nature of the envelope, I think, starts to dissolve that strict separation between the building and the exterior nature. The site is not a traditional urban site, and this exposure to nature all around does mean that we did have this exceptional opportunity to play with this idea of maximizing people's relationship to the outdoors or to nature. From this angle, the shutters reveal the sheer thinness. The handrail captures the blue sky and is opaque. From other angles, the handrail, as you see, is semi-transparent. So wherever you stand, it is, I think, impossible to see where the students are, where the affordable housing or where the penthouses are, which was, of course, the challenge that we set ourselves given this very inclusive approach of the mayor. And perhaps that's kind of, I would say, the major contribution that we've brought to the project of trying to see that actually you could argue homogeneity, repetition, uniformity of facade treatment, in fact, can be can have a big role to play, which is something that perhaps in other projects we may completely question. Seen from below, it transmits floating, stacking, shearing, like a building on the move. So if there is a politics to this building, it is of a different kind. It is a kind that I think it is only done by the building. It relies not on a high budget. It relies on the use of very ordinary materials. And it is to do with how one assembles the different elements, but not in isolation of thinking about the practicalities of everyday life, and how assembling them in a certain way rather than another way creates shifts and prompts other ways of using an apartment building. I don't know how long I've been going. I'll go on to the next one and then I'll stop. This is a project, another residential project. It's much smaller. It is only 3.8 million euros. So it is extremely low budget. It is part of an experimental project initiated by the city of Montpellier to use brownfield sites in the city to explore experimental housing. It has 36 apartments, whereas Nanterre had 91 and it had 110 students, so it is smaller and a smaller budget. Some of the issues, of course, were I think relevant to address again the need to give people natural ventilation. This is the south of France, and it gets very hot, so that's even more important. The right to privacy was still at the back of our mind, how to arrange the building to give them privacy. But here, the city called this kind of set of buildings a folie, which one of 12 folies they would build in the city. Now, the city of Montpellier has a history of building these kind of grand mansions on the outskirts, commissioned by aristocrats and the bourgeoisie as a way to experiment with architecture through this idea of perhaps grandness. But the folie, of course, has a kind of a longer history in the French and the English gardens, which has to do with a playful structure with no practical purpose, placed in a garden or landscape setting, to reflect, ideas of travel, education, pleasure, luxury, and so on. And we understood that the city of Montpellier, by calling this a folie, was really asking us how we can push, the approach to housing beyond the usual reasoning, and how perhaps this foolish play with architecture could actually become a kind of a critical device or a new possibility for market-driven housing. Now, given the warm weather of Montpellier, we decided in this case to really focus on the outdoor spaces of them, because it was clear that the weather meant that they will use the outdoor spaces a lot more intensely. So, like Nanterre, we have a series of elements that are involved in a multi-story residential building. Handrails, envelopes, floor plates, the usual, let's say, standard set of elements that kind of make up a multi-story residential housing. And their grouping is made differently. So the envelope is designed as a 9-story compact shape. This allowed us to go to the maximum height that we were allowed by the regulations, to leave a garden around this building, to create a folie setting, if you like. So there is a garden around this mini tower that can maximize, distant views for the apartments. The core is located centrally, that kind of gray area. The structure, the core is used as structure, so it's kind of marked in red. The rest of the structure is placed on the perimeter of the envelope in order to leave the interior, again, liberated of any load-bearing structure, so that they would have no fixed elements, and that residents can reconfigure them as they will. Like the same strategy on Nanterre. Now, by insetting the envelope, we can create a kind of a balcony all around to maximize, the length of balconies to each apartment. The surround balcony, as we saw before, requires these kind of dividing walls. It's less of a problem when you have, of course, a more compact form, but despite that, we would need it. So if we would pinch, if you like, the balcony at the border between the apartments, we would, of course, remove that dividing wall between them. And if we would think of the envelope, so that inner wall, and not as a kind of a constant border, but as one that shifts constantly, it has inflections. As it wraps the building, we would, of course, change the relationship between the inside and outside, from room to room, from apartment to apartment. Now, and these inflections would would improve the corner balconies, because they would become one, so the corner balconies would become more useful. Now, a problem would still persist between the apartments as exists in the Marina Towers, where you remove the dividing wall, and you see out, but you see into your neighbor as well. That also exists in the Aqua Tower. Again, both of them curved balconies. You see out a lot more, but you have this problem of overlooking. Also, because they are multi-story residential buildings, you also have overlooking downwards, so neighbors can look into each other. And we try to kind of think, well, how could we use or introduce curvature into these kind of balconies, so that we would address the issue of privacy. So we have changed the number of inflections, both to the outer profile of the balcony and its inner profile, or you could say the envelope that divides the inside and outside. And as a result, we have these balconies that located in these situations where they have 180-degree views out, but they do not look at each other. It's impossible for one neighbor to see the other, as you see, for example, here. And there is a kind of a greater sense of interior-exterior continuity, as the inflection to the envelope, of course, impacts both the inside and the outside. In order to reduce the overlooking of the balconies vertically, the inflections in the envelope and the balcony profile are varied further, and we have produced 4 different floor plates that are slightly different, with their balconies in slightly different positions. And these 4 different floor plates are, as a result, on each floor they vary spatially, geometrically, the original brief of the client into apartments that might be the same size, but they have different kinds of spaces inside, different kinds of orientation, balconies that are different in size also and shape. And then we stack them, alternate them, the floor plates, so that they would never, two same floor plates would never repeat. And what this means as a result is that there is a lot more choice. The same two-bedroom apartment would be very different depending on what level it is on and where it is kind of located relative to north, south, etc., etc. As a consequence of this, and I will go through them quickly, you see that the balconies shift from one floor to another, and this kind of, we could say, foolish, playfulness of the shape, in fact, ends up having a big consequence that instead of it produces this situation where balconies are two levels away from each other rather than one. And it also means that some of them are single height and some of them are double height, so it introduces kind of variety to the basic choice residents would have. But it also, more importantly, means that rather than a simple stacking where you would see your neighbor below, the neighboring below, because there are two levels below, the lateral, the downward overlooking is much reduced. So a simple decision about the shape of the floor plate and its location and whether you have one or several floor plates ends up having a kind of a great consequence in people who would live and use these apartments. Now, the handrail of a balcony is another agent. Balconies, handrails of balconies in residential buildings have two contrasting functions to play, to perform. They need to allow you to see out, but not to allow people to see in, so that you have privacy on your balcony. Now, in our case, in the areas that are marked in red, the handrails have an additional, if you like, role, which is that these are the areas where the balconies, maybe I should go back to the view, you can still see the neighbor below. So those are those red areas. So we tried to kind of explore different kinds of uprights or handrail supports, and the difference between having a simple vertical upright instead of doubling it and displacing them. And we realized that has the consequence that it creates a kind of a moire from the outside. The building, it's curvilinear, so the handrail is you're always seeing it at an oblique, so it seems twice as dense from the outside, whereas when you're on the balcony itself, you can see out. So again, a very simple decision that I think that the architect can make along this process. Now, to minimize the vertical overlooking, what we have done is to densify the uprights in those areas where overlooking would occur. So the one on the right. The load-bearing walls, the building is kind of now beyond this, but they are concrete because that's what's preferred in France. It's cheapest to build in concrete. Unfortunately, it needs to be clad to protect it, insulate it, waterproof it. And here we were with a curvilinear form that we did not want to facet. So to minimize the faceting of the curve, the walls are clad with corrugated aluminum panels, and so that they can bend easily. They also have the corrugation absorbs, if you like, the seams, and the seams become less perceptible. Instead of one type of corrugation, we have 3 scales in order to accentuate the curvilinearity. So the densest scale of corrugation is applied to the concave areas, the widest one to the convex. So it's a very subtle, but I think it is visible as the building, as the light changes. Actually, the shadows of the building are amplified because of this small kind of subtle change in the scale of corrugation. The glazing could not be curved because, again, we are dealing with an affordable budget. So it is inset into the kind of the depth of the wall and modulated to approximate a curve. It's not complete, of course, the building, so I cannot show you how people would have occupied it. But I think I'm pretty certain that a building that gives people balconies that are so private and the choice of whether they are more, in fact, more private with an additional outside curtain, or whether they are more exposed, is bound to prompt different kinds of uses from these residents. We don't really know. These are each one of the apartments and how the residents have chosen to subdivide their interior, remembering that they get the choice to come and do that in France. But for sure, we can assume that since the rooms are such different shapes, the whole business of even furnishing your room must be a more creative exercise than if you were given just square rooms. The building kind of prompts that engagement. You have no choice but to think about and remember that, of course, people have had have decided to live here. We can imagine that the curvilinear envelope will bring lots of different kinds of views into each one of these, many more than an orthogonal building would. The unique location of each balcony will frame the outside very differently for its residents. No two balconies will have the same view. The curvilinear shape, you could say it's almost like the experience of sitting on a tree, sometimes perhaps a kind of a smaller one. It's a different kind of relationship to the shape of the balconies ends up feeling less of a neighbor above and perhaps a piece of nature. And of course, they are extremely private. There is the kind of the test of the external curtain that again gives them another way to appropriate their space and to use it for additional privacy if they want. But also it kind of visualizes already now, on the construction side, it visualizes the wind, which is it brings a kind of a feeling of breeze. That or amplifies that feeling, and there is the kind of the dark shadows here that are created, of course, by the kind of the depths of the balconies are unusually deep for the size of the apartments. Again, now in the climate of Montpellier, I think we can assume that some of those activities that we saw at the beginning will happen in these. Now I don't have time to go to the museum, but maybe I can just finish by saying that. I think that the two projects share a way of starting architecture, which is not to start it with a storyline, but kind of start them with a kind of an openness and find the projects and what they become through the process. Of course, with an absolute conviction that architecture has a role to play throughout the whole process, and that are perhaps the opportunity of this complex and unpredictable process for architecture is in fact to use the unpredictability as a way to experiment for a start, and to produce buildings that perhaps we wouldn't have thought about on day one. I don't think that I have presented you both projects as a kind of a linear story, but of course the options and the decisions were found during the process, and many of them had to be fought for. And I think it's a very different way of relating to our contemporary condition, where many people are complaining about the fact that the architect has lost control and the architect has to work alongside many other consultants, and that there are many regulations. I actually think that all of these simply make architecture more influential. If you're willing to be there and to exploit all the dynamics, I think that it only gives more relevance to architecture, and it only brings more food for thought and more opportunities for experimentation. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions if you have any.
Any questions?
I was told you are shy.
Should I have one? So you set up basically like getting this wrong. The agency of architecture is you set that out in terms of micro-political agenda, so to speak. The two projects being very good with respect to what seems to be a simple problem becomes a very intricate one of privacy and the use of alchemists and shading and other houses. But at one point, so I'm just very curious, and I was wondering if you could say just two words or a few words about what you also revealed in the end, the fact that the design process is a slightly more open search. Because what is the balance then between setting out an agenda with such micro-political ambitions, if it exists to begin with, and the specific formal design operations, which are also, particularly in the last one, also very relevant. There must be a certain economy there, so to speak, between some things that pertain to what one does and other things that pertain to either preset or predefined interests or emergent interests in the process.
I mean, my experience is that when you're working on these projects, most of it is assumed, and it's up to you to kind of pick at them. Nobody is going to worry about the handrail unless you make it an issue. And these two housing projects actually are for the same client. And when we started working on the first one, they hated me during the process because they said, well, why are you asking questions about the dividing wall? And we don't make an issue of these. Why do you know? And I think now they kind of understand that actually without really resorting to any complex construction. We've accepted their concrete construction. It's quite dumb, the construction, if you like. With a bigger budget, you could perhaps use post-tension concrete that makes the slab much thinner. We couldn't afford these things. But I think despite that, the project tries to find room for change. And I'm kind of excited by this because I think it shows that architecture is independent of budget, is independent of scale. It's frankly, it is of course, its scope is limited by who the client is. But honestly, the Nanterre project, we started out with a client who was not necessarily appreciative of the approach. Now they are. Now they are. I mean, in fact, they called me more or less as we were finishing Nanterre, and I hope this is not recorded. They said, "Oh, we would like to participate in a competition with you, but there's one condition: you don't touch the interior, you don't ask any questions. You can do what you like to the outside." And I thought, what do I say? Because we are still doing this other one for them. And I said, "Well, I've never offered this before, but we'll do it if you don't use our name." And then he said, "That cannot be. I want you to be proud of your work." I said, "Proud of our work? But you're going to make the decisions." I think now they kind of appreciate, that it can, with just a little bit of, because they've added a little bit of cost to their other projects, but really it's Nanterre is on the fringe, so you can only add so much beyond which it's not possible. I don't know whether I answered your question. I think design process, this is one thing that I've learned through this, and perhaps Mocha started it, Mocha in Cleveland, is that if I have to say what is common in terms of way of working and also the buildings is that they are not organic. They are not about, and the organic project needs that unifying narrative wherever you find it, whether it's the beginning or midway or at the end. The building, we've learned to judge a good building where the part and the whole speak the same language. And I think here the buildings are coherent, but they are speaking different languages at the same time. I mean, this is a simpler building. When I show Mocha, the stair actually has its own, it does its own thing as well as being a stair, and the envelope does certain things. And I think approaching buildings in this non-organic way is I think gives them, makes them more multidimensional. And two, I have found in a very practical way, a way to find a project inside of this sea of unpredictability. It's like imagining yourself as a net being in there, and depending on when you kind of take the net up, it becomes a project versus another project. I do think it's a way of working with contemporary conditions of practice. Now, maybe contemporary conditions of practice will change. I mean, we are in such extreme times of change that 1 minute you think you've mastered a way of practicing, and of course the whole thing could be just thrown into but right now with what I face, I think it's a way of remaining agile and using the way buildings take 6 to 10 years. I mean, it's not interesting if you stick to the same story for 6 or 10 years. And in none of these projects, I say the same thing now than I said 4 years ago, because I've learned through them and we found new things. And I think that's kind of interesting.
I have a question. It's very interesting how you start a lot of discussion on activism, architecture, space, etc. And then you see they do social housing projects or the next ethics. It seems like a trend in many contemporary art, buildings where there is kind of a mix of different kinds of housing styles, social, some of them are premium housing and penthouses. But what I found interesting on their project is that by using elements, and we call them agents and assemblage, to kind of dissolve in an architectural spatial cosmos from the outside. The stabilization inside still kind of maintaining this. So you think that is a kind of contemporary way in which people could approach the politics and the state of social and residential housing.
It's a way, and it's not new, because I showed the Haussmann model, but Georgian and Victorian architecture, etc. We see in London now, they have this kind of uniform facade, and behind it you don't really know how small or large the units are. So it's a way. But for sure, I mean, you say there are people mixing, and that's not my experience. In the UK, there is one good policy that the government has put in place a few years ago, where if a private promoter is building a very large residential building, they must provide X%. It used to be 30 and it's going kind of down, X% of social housing. Now, this is usually dealt with as, two different treatments. Perhaps every so often, Kees Christianse in Holland did one where actually you could not see their differences. I think if we would approach the architecture this way, perhaps developers would not be as anxious about providing, social housing in the mix. Because the problem is that they kind of need to sell to the wealthier, and the wealthier don't want to be seen, unfortunately, living next to other people. So I think perhaps if the architecture is irrespective of kind of wealth expression, and it treats people equally, perhaps we would find a way where we would accommodate more affordable housing in the center of cities. But it's one. Housing is a big issue in the UK. I don't know if it is here, but it's like people are just forever talking about numbers and how to deliver them, but not really asking what kind of housing we need.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.